Hello, I'm Helen Joyce, the Economist's Britain editor, and with me is Olivier Bloom, who is Chief Strategy and Sustainability Officer at Schneider Electric. We're going to be talking about, as it says in the title of this session, going beyond the scope of operational emissions as we talk about companies' responsibilities and aims in focusing on the climate. So that's the things that the company is responsible for beyond just actually running day to day. And Olivier's long experience in various roles at Schneider Electric make him ideally placed to help us to think about that. Olivier, could we start by scoping out what we're talking about here? What are the main aspects of this responsibility beyond day-to-day or operational emissions?
Yeah, for sure. Hi, Helen, and thanks for inviting me today. Look, I think many companies in the world, and Schneider is one of them, have taken commitment when it comes to sustainability. At Schneider, we've started the journey more than 15 years ago. We used to call that, more corporate social responsibility. But in the past years, and probably 2015, between the Paris Agreement on one side and the Sustainable Development Goals creation on the other side, has been a trigger where all companies have realized that they need to have a clear strategy when it comes to ESG and sustainability. As you know, ESG stands for E for environment, S for social, G for governance. And of course, the pillar on E is very critical, and probably what is the biggest piece of the environment topic today, it's really around climate. So for us, Schneider Electric, when you consider the mission of the company, which is to be the digital partner of our customer for efficiency and sustainability, in other words, it's to be their digital partner for the energy transition. It was very obvious that we wanted to be really a role model when it comes to this climate transition and making sure that what we recommend to apply to our customer, we really apply those good recipes for ourselves. And that's a journey that has started at Schneider Electric. This focus on climate and CO2 reduction, I would say approximately 10 years ago.
So it seems to me that what you're talking about is your customers' role model aspect and maybe suppliers as well. Would you think that's a good sort of three-part headings for us as we shape this conversation? So could we talk first then about? Oh, you would add something, would you?
No, yeah, absolutely. And I like to say the focus for many people have started on what you call, the scope 1 and 2, which is your own operation. But you're absolutely right. The challenge about climate is really going beyond the scope of your own operation. And as you rightly said, it's working more with your supplier. It's working more on how you can impact on your customer. But I like also what you can do to engage your employees, which is a third dimension, which is also very important.
Well, so why don't we start then with your customers? So obviously you have a slight head start in that you're actually offering them things to help them to be more energy efficient. But I mean, I think it's interesting for any company to think, how much business is it of yours to engage with what your customers do? Like, how do you start that conversation and actually really help them to change beyond just supplying them with things to change?
That's a very interesting question, Helen. When we are pitching about our company 10 years ago with customer, we are always finishing our pitch by saying to the people, if you don't do it for the planet, do it for your wallet. And at that time, the appetite really to react was not very, very, very strong. The good news in the world of today, most of the large company, and we see that moving to the medium-sized company, have understood that it's not optional anymore to tackle really the energy dilemma that we are all facing. And I think all have understood that they need really to have a very detailed plan for their own operation to see how they could reduce their CO2 emissions. So I would say the demand is very, very high. It's a topic that has gone to the highest level of company. It's a topic that is discussed by executive committee in the boardroom as well. And for sure, I would say naturally to answer your question, the starting point is really when people call you and tell you, hey, I need to do something about climate. I don't know where to start. Can you help me? And usually what we do is really what we call the phase 1, which is really trying to understand what is your carbon footprint, what are your emissions. It's about measuring, fixing a trajectory, where you want to go in 5-10 years from now and what is really feasible. And point number 3, which is really defining what is the roadmap to make sure that you are going really deliver in line with your objectives. So I would say that's usually the starting point of the discussion with customers.
And so who's talking to whom? Is this a discussion between really high-level people? Are your people talking into the board? Or is it more like any other ordinary acquisition?
I would say a couple of years ago, it was probably still a discussion of experts where you discuss between the people of Schneider and on the customer side, you discuss with the head of sustainability, Sometimes it's a head of procurement. Sometimes it was a head of a business unit, which was a bit more advanced on the topic. But I have to say, definitely the topic has gone to the highest level. So it's a combination of people who are more inside the machine and who have really to deliver. But also there is a very high attention now that has gone to the highest level of the company, because companies have to take commitment. They have to take public commitment. They have to report more and more on those non-financial metrics. Investors have a lot of interest. So to answer your question, there is a huge variety of people who are interested inside the company, but definitely the highest part of the company is much more engaged than it was the case 2 or 3 years ago.
So if I could ask you, suppose you were not at a company that people called to say, help me with my emissions. You were just, you're a large supplier, you work with many large companies around the world and you give them something else, I don't know what. Is it appropriate when they call you to start that conversation about working together that you might say, and can we discuss going beyond the scope of operational emissions in the title of our talk? Like, is there a moment when that would come up, and would that be an appropriate thing to do? And if so, what hints would you give another company in doing that? What have you learned that you could pass on?
I think it's very important. You have companies, first of all, like Schneider, that can help you really to go through a decarbonization journey. But I think we are all the customer or the supplier of someone. So I think it's very, very important that we work as a global ecosystem. We talked a lot about what we can do for our customer, but Schneider Electric has decided also to go through the decarbonization of our own supplier. So that's very important that we discuss with them. That's very important that we understand their business, that we understand their constraints, and so on and so forth. So I would say if there is only one topic that unify all company, all sectors, competitor, non-competitor, it's really the topic of climate, because we can, all of us, help somebody else in the value chain. So I think we have a common interest to dialogue, to share best practice, and to see how each of us can provide a service with less CO2 emission at the end of the value chain. So I would say that's a very, very natural topic for company to engage wherever you are in the value chain.
So this is actually a big change in the way people think. I mean, if we were talking a decade ago, if you were chatting to The Economist a decade ago, we would probably be talking about diversifying your supply chain in order to make it more resilient. We'd be talking about, very enthusiastically about just in time and about globalization driving down costs and things. I don't think we'd be talking either about climate to such an extent, or indeed anything that brought you inside the walls of other companies so much. Like, this is all about having strong relationships with your suppliers and your customers that you expect to last and that also give you visibility inside their operations. How has that shift happened? And are people still a bit uncomfortable with allowing you to see inside their operations to the extent you have to understand their carbon emissions?
Look, I think there is a huge variety of behavior depending on the maturity of the company. But if I give you another example, 10, 15, 20 years ago, companies were talking, for instance, with their supplier on everything which was related to the human rights. Do you have the right policy inside your company? And we were asking our supplier. Now it's about climate. I think everyone has realized that the way we are managing our operation, all of us, whether you are in a private company or a government or education or whatever, it's not sustainable. So we have a common interest that we all act towards the trajectory of the Paris Agreement. If not, we compromise the future. We compromise the future for our own generation and for future generation. We cannot leave anyone on the side. You have to embark. What I like, for instance, when we speak with supplier, is you have in front of you a very large number of companies which are small to medium-sized companies. So it's super important that you bring those companies on board. Now, you were asking, do you face resistance? I would say less and less, because the appetite is high. And if it's not a business appetite, it's sometimes something a bit more personal, it's a bit more philosophical, but what I'm going to leave behind me for my kids, for the next generation. So that's really a topic where you see all people, all stakeholders working together, because we need to find the solution and we need to find it together. I'll give you an example. We launched a program at Schneider Electric to help our supplier to divide by 2 their CO2 emission by 2025. So basically, we want to make all our knowledge, all our technology, all our training available to our supplier. We targeted 1,000 suppliers 6 months ago. 6 months after, 95% of them have registered to the program. I was amazed. When you asked me the question, do you see resistance? At the beginning of the program, I was expecting maybe 50% plus. But without making a lot of push, 95% I say, hey, we are with you. We are on board. If you help us to go through that journey, we really need to go. So to answer you with concrete number, I don't see a lot of resistance at that stage, but more appetite to do more.
That's really, really interesting. So can I ask for sort of 2 or 3 things that end up being the first most impactful things that a company does with you when it's on that journey, whether it's a supplier or a customer? So someone else who's thinking of doing something similar and maybe offering through their supply chain, some sort of incentive or target or partnership, where should they be focusing their efforts concretely?
Well, look, what I'm going to tell you is maybe something very obvious, but I would say it starts first with the leadership. For us, what is really the starting point of the discussion is to check if the leadership is engaged or not. If not, you can spend hours and hours in seminar, in workshop, discussing, but nothing is going to move. So you need to make sure at the top of the company, there is really a willingness to do more. That's the starting point. The second point, which is very, 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 very important, is to measure. CO2 emission, it's like, when you measure your own weight or whatever, and you want to lose weight, you want to gain weight, whatever, you need to know where is the starting point, and you need to define really an ambition. So there is a certain number of steps which are very, very important that you have to follow carefully if you don't want this to be just a one shot. We speak a lot at Schneider Electric about active energy management. You don't want to be in a kind of one shot effort for 1 month, 1 year, and at the end of the day, it's not sustainable. So leadership, measuring, fixing the trajectory, and then you have to identify what are the most important things, what are the most important levers, and then it really depends. Company by company. Some company will spend a lot of time on renewable electricity. That's probably the first quick win. Some company will work on mobility, how I'm going to move all my fleet to an electrical fleet. Some of them will be more focused on energy consumption. So that really, really depends on the profile of the company. Some of them will go straight with their supplier because their own CO2 emissions are very, very small. So that really, really depends. But we have quite a lot of good experience to guide company on where to start and where to focus first.
That's an incredibly interesting shopping list, like just really clear. Are there more and more sort of automated tools that enable people to do this in a really efficient way where you can just pick things off the shelf to help you and guide you through thinking through this?
Yeah, that's a very good question. First of all, I think the science has helped us, and there is a lot of regulation that have been put in place around the science-based target. So the good news, first of all, you see more and more, I would say, regulation about the way you measure your carbon emission. You start to see tools that help you really to structure your data, making sure you have something to measure. And for instance, what we have developed over the past 10 years at Schneider Electric is a kind of ERP. You think usually about ERP as a tool, to support your financial data inside a large organization. But we have worked a lot on building an ERP of energy and sustainability. Basically, it's a kind of one single source of truth for a company where you have all your energy data translated in CO2 emission that help you real time, for instance, to monitor the evolution and to be able, thanks really to machine learning and artificial intelligence, to have automated, recommendations, what we call digital services that help you really to improve. So digital is playing a big role in the acceleration. We see more and more tools coming, and it's a great news because only by automating really those programs, those transformations will be the solution to really progress sustainably.
Do you have any data that you share with people about like how much they're going to save by doing this? I mean, I know you say that people are increasingly very keen on doing it anyway, but of course, companies have to look at the bottom line. And with energy consumption, well, there's a win-win.
We have a standard data that we share for buildings. Buildings overall represent 30% of the CO2 emission because energy is a big part anyway of the CO2 emission. And when you look at buildings, we usually say at Schneider Electric, by implementing simple solution, you can definitely save easily in the next 3 years 30% of your energy consumption. So the return on investment, it's quite obvious to demonstrate. That just to give you one example on buildings, 30% saving in energy that translates directly into CO2 emission saved.
And I guess that as time goes by and more companies make this journey, there'll be similar sort of headline figures that you can give on, transport if it's a company that uses a lot of transport, or, production of certain very high CO2 things like concrete or something like that. Yes.
Yeah, and to go beyond what the example I've just mentioned, I was talking about existing building. Now, when you can convince companies to look at their CO2 emission at the time of the design of the construction, we have, for instance, at Schneider, a company which is called RIB, which is really specialized in designing buildings, and they have added one dimension in their simulation model, which is a sustainability dimension. What does it mean? It means that at the phase of design, you simulate different type of design according to the CO2 emission. So if you are really entering in those discussions at the early stage, I can tell you that the impact is even bigger than the example that I've mentioned before. For instance, at Schneider, we have launched a new building in France, in the south of France, where we have all our R&D team. It's a carbon neutral building, basically. So we produce energy thanks to solar. We save energy that we store, that we give back to the local utility. So when you do at the end of the year an overview on how much you have produced versus how much you have consumed, actually you are carbon neutral. So more and more, when company will work at the early stage, they will have opportunity to generate huge saving in terms of CO2 emission.
So last year I did quite a lot of webinars for people on things like trade and supply chains. And of course, everyone was in the depths of lockdown, and it was fascinating to hear how companies were continuing to work through it. And one theme that came up over and over again was that keeping going through the lockdown meant working more closely with your suppliers and your customers in a way that you never had to before. So I wonder, have you seen any impact from the pandemic and that sort of supply chain management that, had to be quite heroic actually during it, impacting upon this sort of work?
You're absolutely right. I hope that in 5-10 years from now, we will be out of this pandemic, and maybe we will say at that point of time that has brought probably a certain number of good news together with the bad news. And what I mean here is, number one, even beyond what you said, I think people have realized during the pandemic that the way we all live on the planet is not sustainable, for sure. So I think that's something which is a common pattern for all the people. But point number two, going to your point, indeed, I think it has forced the people to think about shorter supply chain, how you can really get your raw material, your component, your labor closer to you to make sure that you have a supply chain which is much more resilient. And guess what? That's a very, very good news from a CO2 standpoint, because that also at the same time reduces CO2 emission. And let's not forget that in parallel of the pandemic, we have a certain number of geopolitics events that I'm not going to comment in detail, but we see some friction, some rupture between different geographies. It's more complicated, to deal with different geography everywhere in the world. And we see that also forcing the people to think about a strategy which is a bit different, more a kind of multi-local strategy with, again, shorter supply end. And all those factors together with the pandemic are definitely going into a direction which probably will be a good news, again, for the climate impact.
So as we're coming towards the end of the conversation, I'd like to challenge you to suggest the 2 or 3 biggest tips that you would give to somebody who's maybe a little behind on this journey, like somebody who's just woken up a bit late to what people are saying. You've already said that when you're working with partners, or if you're turning to an outside people, you really have to get the leaders involved. But what other concrete tips would you give to somebody who's trying to make a big move along this journey?
One, make sure the leadership is really engaged. That's very important. To start by measuring and fix an ambition, a direction, and deal with climate like you deal with a business. In business, you define a long-term strategy. You define a certain number of actions to achieve your strategic priority next year. You make sure you have the right people, competent people. Climate should be another dimension in the company. You have a chief people officer, you have a chief finance officer, you have a chief supply chain officer. Make sure you have a chief climate officer, who is going to put a strategy and deal with that topic like any other topic in the company, and making sure at the end of the day it is reviewed at the highest level of the company.
Well, thank you so much. That was just all extremely interesting, Olivier, and very actionable, I think, for our listeners too. I'd like to invite everybody to stay and enjoy the next session as well. Thank you all so
Thanks
much.
very much.